now it's Cafe CLIL number 8.
It's
Good
number
to
eight,
see you.
Keith. Yeah, yeah, good to see you. Wow, time flies when you're enjoying yourself. Is that whoops, my cup's out of focus there. Yeah. Egunon and Kaixo, as I would say in Basque. Today,
Okay.
can I just get it in? Today is Basque International Day of the Basque Language, which of course was instituted by the Basque government. It wouldn't be likely to be instituted by anybody else. But
Yeah.
it's international, of course. December the 3rd was, in fact, the day that Saint Francis Xavier died in China, and apparently his last word. He was born in the Basque Country, well, in Navarra, and his last words apparently were uttered in Euskera, in Basque, and he said, "Basque go into the world," or "Basques go into the world." So
What a wonderful story. I
yeah,
mean, with our theme on teacher language for CLIL, what a great context to have Basque National Day and the story about the Basque language. I've started studying Estonian. Did I tell you that?
no, my God, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
I'm not going to go into detail about that right now, but we might have a session where we talk about other languages in our experiences, because of course you're a very interesting background with your Spanish, your Basque, and a Brit living in that context.
Yeah.
And the same, I think, with my background with Bulgarian
Bulgarian,
and
yes.
other languages I'm interested in. Today, we're going to talk about the English language for the CLIL teacher. And I wanted, again, I'm going to put you on the front of the stage with, from our book, we have this wonderful quadrant which shows the scale and range of language levels and the scale and range of pedagogical competence. And I think that's a very important framework to start with, because I think sometimes the discussion can get confused by being focused on language when there are many other things to bear in mind. Would you say a few words about that quadrant, that
Yes,
matrix?
yes, thank you, Keith, for bringing that up. And I was saying that I think I invented it. I'm we put it in the book, of course, but if I didn't invent it and someone out there did, then please don't take me to court. I haven't got any money. But anyway, yeah. Well, the quadrant, of course, is based on what it calls. I've got it here. It's the at the top you've got the pedagogic, let's say, pedagogic experience or ability or knowledge, and the other part of the quadrant is the linguistic aspect of it. And so what tends to happen is that if you look at the northwest of the quadrant, then you've got CLIL pedagogy and language ability plus. Okay, so you've got the pedagogy and you've got the language. And of course,
Yeah.
that's the ideal quadrant to be in. And but of course, it's unrealistic. That's not the case. We've all seen people teaching, and I'm not being critical, of course, but you don't get these perfect models. There's no perfect
Yeah.
model. And even I have of course seen teachers who've had the pedagogy and the language, and of course
Yeah.
they're wonderful. But what tends to happen is you tend to find in the northeastern quadrant, let's say, is what we're more realistic, what we're looking at. So you've got the CLIL pedagogy, but the linguistic ability is not necessarily C2 or C1 or something. And this is where the controversy comes
Yeah.
in. We'll talk about it later. But of course,
Yeah.
it's far more important. It's far more important that the teacher has the CLIL pedagogy than somehow being a wonderful speaker, because of course the southwest quadrant shows you what the lie would be, because the southwest quadrant says language ability and zero CLIL pedagogy. So the idea in that case would be that any native speaker of English would be capable of teaching CLIL, which is
Yeah,
not
I
true.
think
Which is not true.
it's such a wonderful diagrammatical structure to have this discussion, I think, because it allows us to talk about all the options. Let me chuck in
Mm.
a bit of a definition, because in our book we also separate three levels of language that are important, all important to be considered. Subject-specific terminology, of course, and then there's general academic language, which is not specific to any subject, could be cross-curricular. And then we've got peripheral, organizational, conversational, classroom language, and they all play a role. And I think the native speaker question is one that causes problems within this discussion, because we're assumed to be the best model, but actually that forgets about the pedagogy.
It forgets
completely.
about, yes, of course, and it forgets about the pedagogy when you start moving into CLIL. I think that, we'd have to rewind a little bit and look at where this discussion's coming from. And I think it's
Yeah,
coming, if you
yeah,
go back to the 70s and 80s, well, I think Munby was the first person who researched teacher talk, for example. No, there was a big controversy about that because Munby was talking about he researched teachers' perceptions of their own teacher talk. And one of the interesting ones was the quantitative perception, no? And that he interviewed people, and
yeah, yeah,
teachers would tend to say, I'm talking about language teachers here. Language teachers would tend to say, "Ah, yeah, well, I reckon, my teacher talk is something like I perhaps talk 40, at the most 50% of the time." And of course, Mumby's research showed that it was at least 80% of the time, and so.
incredible.
And so, this that created a slight shift, I think, in the ELT world after that, and this idea
Yeah,
that we now talk about well, that Mercer, that Gibbons, and people we've talked about before talk about teacher talk being more dialogic, about getting the kids to talk. It's
yeah,
very
yeah,
obvious,
yeah,
and there was also that scrap, in a sense, in the old times between the Krashen's comprehensible input. So yeah, all people who've been through the ALT path will have heard of Krashen's language plus one, which is fine, input plus one.
yeah, yeah,
But then Merrill Swain came in with the idea of comprehensible output, and I preferred that, of course, as a CLIL person. I always preferred the Swain side. I mean, obviously both are important,
yeah,
but,
yeah. It's
but
worth mentioning at that point the cognitive discourse functions debate and work that's going on, because, of course, the curriculum functions, the curriculum objective descriptors need to be very closely associated with the language the teacher is using in the classroom, as much as assessing the progress of the learners in the classroom. And I think that study, as well as Dalton Puffer's publication on content and language integrated learning about 10 years ago, I think, showing that teachers have much higher expectations than reality shows in the classroom. So in a way, the work on the CDS brings everybody's feet down to ground and brings reality back into the classroom.
well, it also gets us onto this point about domains and the particular domain of language or discourse subject language that a CLIL teacher needs to master to a large extent, let's say. But when you've seen CLIL teachers, I've seen lots of CLIL teachers teaching, and they tend to fall down on things like classroom management, and they often say, "Oh, I'm okay with the particular discourse of the subject, but it's the classroom management that gets me." University teachers often say that as well. I'm
Yeah,
coaching a couple of teachers now who said, "Phil, I don't need the CALP, I don't need the academic language. What I need is the management language." And so there's always that tension, I think.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
But
My wife teaches. Did you want to carry on with your thought? I
well, no,
interrupted you.
I was just going to say that a language teacher perhaps doesn't have that feeling so strongly because a language teacher in that language textbook doesn't go so deeply into those domains. They only go into that domain as so far as the author of the
Yeah,
textbook will have permitted them to go.
yeah,
Again,
yeah.
whatever the off the page topic is that we talked about last week. Sorry, go on.
I think it's a very good example of how. So my wife's Bulgarian. She practiced medicine in the UK. She had to get a professional language assessment board qualification in order to show that she could function in medicine through English.
Yeah.
And and that assessment gets doctors to take notes and do the dialogue with actor patients. So it's not just knowing the disease and what to prescribe. It's the interaction that's assessed there. And I think in a way, clearly is also very much about how teachers organize the dynamic, which we talked about last time. How teachers decide on subject-specific terminology, what they do with it. And then there's another aspect, which is this general academic language, which is so hugely important and largely overlooked, I think, but could bring a focus on language in education very much together, because you look at cause and effect in the social sciences as much as you do in the natural sciences, and so bringing all that language together could equally help the learners as much as the teachers, I think.
Well,
Anyway, we got a
yeah,
contribution
yeah,
from I forgot to mention Andreas Berntal at the beginning, and I think his example is a very good short discussion of how the language of the subject specialist is the most important thing. How they function in that language in the classroom is the most important thing. Not necessarily how accurate they are,
yeah.
how good their pronunciation is, for example, which can colour this discussion. So shall we pause for Andreas and then come back?
Go for it. Yeah.
In fact, your perspective is one from a very very interesting background because of your work with and in vocational high schools in Austria. And the question is about vocational teachers and their specific language. And
Yeah.
I asked you in a mail, what's your perspective on this authentic language? Maybe you could say a few words about that.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. So, well, the question many of those vocational teachers ask themselves before getting into the CLIL stream, is my English good enough? Because many of them, they are fully aware of our students' language skills. And many of them, they are really fantastic, they are brilliant. That has changed so much in the last 10 to 15 years. So many of the vocational teachers, they are kind of afraid because they're not sure whether they would be able to keep up with the students' language skills. And I very often recommend looking into the CEFR first, because, well, for us, the language teachers, the Common European Framework, we are so much familiar with that.
Yeah.
But if you're not from the language business, probably you've never come across that. So
Absolutely.
have a quick look into it and see what does it actually mean to be a B1 speaker or to be a B2 listener or a reader. And this very often comes as a real boost for teachers' self-confidence, I guess.
Yeah.
Reading those descriptions
Yeah.
that go together with the different levels.
Yeah.
And many of those teachers, they've got experience. Many of them have worked in international environments before, attended conferences, trade fairs, exhibitions, whatever. Many of them might have used English as a company language before. So their experience is there, and this is just great.
Yeah.
And well, the authentic language, yes, this is actually what we want them to bring into the classroom. And by authentic language, I mean, well, the language of people who are in engineering, who are in science, people who are in business. The language they use when talking to people in the same businesses, in engineering and science. And this is the language is often, well, it is often different to what you find in course books. Yeah. So it's different to everyday English or general English or whatever. And by different, I mean, sometimes it's different in grammar. Well, I personally, I like to use present perfect tense a lot. Simple and continuous. I just love it. But honestly, if you don't, does it really matter that much?
Sure.
Present tense and past tense do a good job too.
Yeah.
And then very often authentic language in science and engineering, it might be different when it comes to pronunciation.
Yeah.
So you might have learned from your English teachers, well, you need to pronounce the word like this and that. And while your mechanical engineering teacher does it differently. But this is that the way those people speak. And sometimes, well, it's kind of different when it comes to meaning, the words and terms they use. Well, one of my examples, is, well, I usually talk about speed, how fast something goes. For me, this is speed. But my physics teaching colleague, he says, well, Andreas, look, velocity is the word we are
Yeah,
looking
yeah,
for.
yeah,
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 okay, it's fine. Of course, I've come across the word velocity before.
yeah.
For me, it doesn't make a difference whether I've
Sure,
seen
sure.
your velocity. But for him in physics, yes,
Yeah,
of
yeah,
course, this is
yeah,
important.
yeah, yeah,
So very often as a language teacher, you cannot really provide authentic language from those fields or businesses. You
yeah,
simply can't.
yeah.
And this is why we are so happy with CLIL teachers and their
Yeah.
authentic language in the classroom.
Andreas mentions two critical areas. One is this subject-specific language area, and then the other area is self-confidence. And he's very, I think, very clear in his argumentation. What teachers need is to be aware of how well they function in their subject specialisms, not to be hung up by having the king's pronunciation, having standard English structure. It's about functioning within their specialist areas.
Yeah, no, I like very much what he says, and I remember him. I saw him do a talk where he used that phrase as well when he talked about, does it really matter? And it only matters within the certain context. They say again the domain context of what's going on. So it does matter about speed and velocity, but it doesn't matter if
Yeah,
you don't pronounce certain words correctly because
yeah,
I can. There's a slight echo of Elf in what Andres was saying. I never asked Andres if he was into that. The English as a lingua franca movement
yeah,
in the early
yeah,
noughties. Barbara Seidlhofer. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. There's a slight echo of what he's saying there, and although I was quite controversial, I agree with everything Andres says there. I mean,
yeah,
it's absolutely spot on, and I think what he's pointing out again is the difference between a CLIL even an ESP sort of teacher, as even an English for specific purposes might go down the same argument as he's coming out with there. That we're not really looking at this sort of holistic ability in a teacher, but rather these rather more specific domain abilities, and that's what the CLIL teacher in
yeah,
the end is concerned with. And and again, we don't want. We'll get onto this again, but we'll get onto this in a moment because it's a natural progression from what Andres is saying. But we don't want teachers talking all the time anyway. That's another point.
exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, you've said that before, haven't you? That if you want your students to talk less yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that's important. But it's also another thing I would say about that phenomenon is with Austrians, again, on our course in the University of Education in Vienna over many years, several times I've had high-level science and engineer subject teachers say, you know, this is useful for helping me simplify the language I use in German as a mother tongue in my lessons.
Yeah.
CLIL is about honing in on essential language, isn't it? And I think that's very telling, and it's very satisfying when colleagues who come on courses get that aha moment, that it's about whatever the language is, it's making it as accessible as possible and organizing it to be as usable as possible for students, guiding input, supporting output.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think, and what you're saying is it's a perfect twist on the old language teaching idea of the teacher as model. There's no reason why that should be wrong. But the problem is that in the past, teachers model, the teacher was the model because that was the only thing the kids got, and it's very different now. The only thing the kids got was the teacher's English, and that horrible tinny cassette player that you had in the corner. That's all they had.
Absolutely.
Obviously
Absolutely.
they've now got access to so many Englishes that as Andrea said, why should the teacher be trying to reflect all those Englishes? The teacher is simply trying to
Absolutely.
do the best class I saw. I think one of the best classes I ever saw was actually in Doha in Qatar. You were involved in that project as well, and I went to see a maths teacher teaching, and I would say that looking at the CFR. if I'd had to judge him as a Cambridge examiner, he was probably about a B1, certainly in the way he was
Okay.
speaking to me before
Okay.
the class. His English wasn't fantastic. His English wasn't fantastic, but it was fine. You know, it was fine
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
purposes that he was demonstrating. But it was one of the best classes I've seen because he confined, if you like, he confined his language to simply talking about the mathematical functions. His
Yeah.
instructions were very clear, and the kids
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
doing the business. And then he got the kids to answer and to speak. Well, I mean, obviously there wasn't much stretched language, but there was certainly
Sure. Yeah.
there was plenty of mathematical discourse flying around that classroom, and that's what I liked
Yeah.
about it. But he didn't. I don't think he was even a B2 speaker, but he
Okay.
knew how to let's say confine his language to
Yeah. So
just
he's
simply.
he's in the northeast quadrant in that schema,
Yes,
isn't he?
exactly, exactly. He was
Yeah.
way. He was a northeastern. He was a northeastern chap. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Like yourself, like yourself.
Well, yeah, probably. Yeah, yeah.
um, uh, Now, one thing I wanted to come back to is some of the teachers who come on my courses because they are worried about their language level, and they do have the CEFR in their minds because it is part of government policy. Maybe governments are aiming for C1 as a standard for CLIL teachers. But even in your EDC documentation, you can see that it's not a fixed goal. It's a suggestion
Yeah.
that C1 is a target, if you like, and B2 is to be a minimum level. Those are suggestions. They're not fixed. And I think when teachers come with this idea of the CFR in their minds, what I have to do is similar to the things I do with learners. It's put them in context where they're going to use language and get them to see how well they can function rather than be worried about being pigeonholed. Because let's face it, the CFR is about leveling learners. It's not about deciding on competence and pedagogy of teachers because they're very different things, aren't they?
Yeah, yeah. Well, they're different. They're connected, obviously, but no, we'll come back to confidence because I think that's important, and I wouldn't wish. I don't think we should be saying that that's not important, and it is. And teachers do have this self-perception
Yeah,
thing,
yeah,
that they're a bit embarrassed about the language that, as
yeah,
Andrea said. Andrea said now often in vocational education the kids might actually have better English than them. But
absolutely.
yeah, absolutely. But I would also reply to Andres by saying there that, well, better English in what sense? Now, they haven't got better English in that domain sense. So they might have better general English, yeah. I mean, but again, that's because of the availability of English. That's what we're
Yeah,
saying. So
yeah.
it's a kind of misperception on the teachers
But
side.
it's also a question of what teachers are trying to do about improving their self-confidence, and there are many options available to people who want to improve whatever language
Yeah,
they're trying to improve. I mean, with the preschool and primary teachers who come on my courses, we perform the language that they're expected to produce. That will even be me performing something, recording it, and their homework is to go away and have a look and mimic and come back and reproduce it the next day. We do that with stories, we do that with science processes, all of it's recorded in audio and scripted, and they go away and practice and come back. And I think in a way, being fixated on CFR levels and Cambridge exams moves away from let's face it, the fun of practicing and the experience of improving your language level, which is really, I think, what CLIL is all about. It's about putting learners and teachers in contexts where they can see that they can function in a domain area.
well, that's right. But I'm just staying with the CFR. I mean, there's a point we haven't mentioned, and there's a general CFR that talks about those general levels, but also the CFR does, although it's brought the idea of reception, production, mediation in. But if we go back to the four skills, it's very useful to think about that for a PIL teacher because I
Yeah.
was talking about Basque at the beginning, and my own Basque is I can reflect on my own Basque. Of course, I live here,
Okay.
and I reckon on a good day, well, when I was working with in a Basque institution where no one spoke Spanish and some people spoke English, but most of the time it was Euskera all the time. What I found was that my level of pedagogic Basque was really high. It was really high. I could fool people into thinking I was a C1 if I was talking about skills and cognitive blah blah blah, you know. But if you ask me to tell you what happened in the supermarket last night when I was shopping, I would struggle and I would be dropping back down to a sort of A2 level or something because
Sure,
I'm
sure.
not used to that kind of transactional or even conversational Basque in a sense.
Yeah, yeah,
But what I found is that, you know, if I'm controlling the context and I'm talking about myself, for example, and my own experience,
yeah,
not the supermarket,
yeah,
but then my Basque is quite high. I think that my Basque production is actually better than my Basque reception. And it's odd, you know, my wife sort of, she's a bit sarcastic about this because she's, in some ways, she's the other way around, although I think her Basque, she's English, her Basque is in general better than mine.
right.
But better than what? What does that mean? You know, if I look at the CFR, I can judge myself
Yeah,
on
yeah.
different levels for different skills. And again, I
I,
think that
I,
teachers
I, I
don't do this.
I again refer to my wife who graduated with a complete A in the Bulgarian system from an English language grammar school, then practiced medicine in the UK in English, you know, high levels of language. But the first time she came to England with me, we went to Whitby. She wanted an ice cream. She wouldn't go and buy an ice cream. And I think, you know, the aim of all language and CLIL education is if you can't order an ice cream, you failed, basically. You know, it, uh, you might have high qualifications, but if you can't do it, then there's something missing in all of that. And that's unfair on my wife, I know, because she does do medicine in English to a very high level these days. But you know, I think that's quite important, isn't it? It's the function of what's expected in the curriculum that we should be focusing on, both for learners and for teachers.
That's right. That's right. I mean, going back to you know, your point about the three types of language. It's also true that teachers can lose confidence if their management language, for example, isn't
Yeah,
what they perceive good enough, say, to control a class. You know, first it's crowd control, then it's CLIL,
yeah,
or then it's whatever. You know, it's they do
yeah,
have to have the language of the crowd control, and perhaps at higher levels, university, vocational education, they also need to have the kind of language to be able to respond to things they haven't planned. You often hear teachers saying that, you know, I'm okay, Phil, when
yeah,
I'm talking, when I'm doing my lecture, Phil, I'm okay, but when the students ask me questions, I'm not so confident. And so I mean, that's fair enough, you know, but that's
yeah,
absolutely
yeah,
right.
yeah.
And you can help teachers in that sense.
I
But
think so. I mean, that language comes from the curriculum functions, but it also comes from the classroom dynamic, doesn't it? And that book I mentioned, it's Slattery and Willis, English for Primary Teachers.
yeah,
It's for EFL teachers, but that language is contextualized in the dynamics of the primary classroom. And I use that with CLIL teachers who come on my courses, but all the contexts are CLILified, if that's a word, so that the language that they're expected to function in is scripted exactly for, let's say, the growth cycle of a plant, for example.
yeah.
And I think that's very useful. That's what pre-service teacher training could be doing usefully for potential CLIL teachers, is having them studying their subject specialism, but then the pedagogical part, looking at how to deliver the functions of their future curriculum through a foreign language.
Yeah, yeah. Let's just be more specific about that because we've talked about the cognitive discourse functions before, but just in case anybody listening to this is going, well, what are those? You know, let me just say what they are. I mean, according to Dalton Puffer, anyway, she says they're categorize, define, describe, evaluate, explain, explore, and report. And so all language, in a sense, all classroom language, all domain classroom language can, in subject discourse, can be included in all of those. That's where it comes in. So if you make, as you said, if you make teachers aware of those discourse functions, it gives them a different perspective on their own classroom language. It's very important. It's
And that, just sorry to interrupt, just but to contrast that with what Andreas was saying, teachers have a fear of their level because it's CEFR leveled rather than leveled at the cognitive discourse function moment. And I think that's the problem with using CFR for teacher leveling. It should be associated with their curriculum functions.
You just said something super important there, Keith. That is very, very important what you just said there, and that's come out of a spontaneous conversation, dialogic conversation. You see, I mean, the whole idea of this podcast goes back to Hattie. We keep going on about John Hattie's famous points of efficiency, but when you look at teacher talk with Hattie, what comes highest on the curve on efficiency is what he calls teacher clarity. And that's exactly what we've been talking about. That goes back to my Qatar anecdote. No, the teacher clarity was very high there. The general performance of that teacher in English was probably much lower than that. But who cares? As Andrea says, who cares? You know, he that was a very efficient class, and the kids were learning maths, and they were able to answer his questions in not in a particular not in a particularly dialogic sort of way, whatever. But let me just read you what Hattie says. He says there needs to be a shift from monologue to dialogue. He says we have to prioritize listening. All right, I'm not quite sure what that is. He says reduce teacher-dominated talk. Adjust talk based on the learning stage, not on the linguistic stage. The learning stage, cognitive. No? Focus on high-quality feedback. That's something we could do perhaps on a different session. No? And
I mean, I think so. I think one of the issues to have a dig at native speakers, of which we are both, is they can be less aware of how they fill space with language because it's so natural, you know. And for non-native learners, non-native speaker learners, that needs to be filtered in some way, whether it's the teacher saying less or the dynamic of task focusing them on just parts of what's being uttered very, very quickly and fully, you know. And I think in a way that's the benefit that non-native speaker teachers bring, because they naturally control this outburst of language, particularly when they go through CLIL courses.
This outburst of language, absolutely. No, I'm looking at my own experience as a trainer. You know, and I've trained teachers mostly in English, but I've trained them in Spanish and I've trained them in French, and I found I was okay in all those three. French possibly. I sometimes would think about the French before I went in to train them. I would have been okay, but I felt confident enough to do it. But Euskera in Basque, if I was training or assisting in a training session in Basque, which I often did, I was spending 2 or 3 days before going, okay, I've just got these. And I've got these phrases I can come out with, you know, and I'm going to wait for my moment and come out with them. And, you know, and I was terrified of it going away from me. So I know exactly what the teacher means in that sense. You know, I wasn't as confident. Of course I wasn't. I mean,
you know, we had a group of colleagues from the Cyprus CLIL section of the Ministry of Education in Cyprus. They brought us a gift called a talking wall. Have you come across a talking wall before? It's basically a big poster-sized wall hanging with lots of pockets, and each pocket has a chip in it, so you can put images in all the pockets, and the children can record themselves talking. Might be words, might be a story sequence, and then listen back to it. I think teachers could be doing this if they want to feel more confident about their language, not necessarily with a talking wall, but spend every single day doing what you did for your Basque training session. Record yourself, listen back to it, get somebody to comment on it. And, you know, there are so many wonderful things that teachers can do to help build their own confidence. And this is exactly what we do on the courses in Plovdiv. Usually it's me recorded, or these days, text-to-speech software, where they choose the texts and you can choose any language you like, and male or female and with several accents these days, to record an audio based on your text.
No, it's
so
true.
it's all there.
And then the resources that are available now, Keith, compared to before, you've probably seen that website called Uglish, U as in you, and Glish, Uglish. It's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. You just go on it, and if you're like university teachers, vocational education teachers who are using quite specific, lexis, they often say, "Ooh, not sure about how to pronounce this." And Uglish is a great gift, because you go onto it, you put in some obscure word, and and you get YouTube takes. with people speaking, using these words in context, in sentential
Okay.
context.
Okay.
You can just keep
Okay.
clicking, clicking, clicking to listen. You can put it in
Yeah. Yeah.
in American English, British English. Wonderful. English is fantastic for that. So again, there's you can prepare yourself for that, as you say.
Yeah, yeah. I think the other aspect of this that we're talking about is age, isn't it? Because we have talked before our meeting about Italy and Italian colleagues and the government around 2000 after 2011 deciding to have minimum levels requirement of language for CLIL teachers officially. I think they're suggestive these days rather than fixed goals. But I think the question about the Italian colleagues is they're younger and younger teachers who are coming on my courses these days, and that's going to change the whole
Yeah.
discussion about language level and competence, because the younger teachers are maybe quite naturally coming with more English on the courses.
Yeah, they're more confident. We've noticed that here. Yeah, they've got more confidence. What you have to do then is fine tune their didactic English, if you like. You know it's that fine tuning. But they've got
Yeah,
that basis, and so it's changing. I mean, Italy. I don't want to be critical, but I think that the Italian thing was a classic example of political demand.
mm,
Overcoming a realistic demand. So the idea that the teachers had to be, I think, B2s or C1s, B2s, I think it was. There's a
yeah,
big, in general terms, there can be a big leap between B1 and B2 if you want to look at it in general terms. And
yeah,
of course,
yeah,
those teachers weren't assessed in the end on their pedagogic language; they were assessed on their general language. So, what was the
yeah,
point? And so the Italian government spent a lot of money on something they could have saved a lot of money by first of all by looping the training.
yeah,
You could have looped the training and just talked about pedagogic ability going back to the quadrant, and then
yeah,
improve their language levels
yeah,
whilst you were
yeah,
doing that. They've seen that now. I think they've seen that. I
yeah,
don't
yeah,
want to be overcritical, but there was that legislation in Italy, and
yeah,
politically speaking, you can't say, well, all teachers can be A2. You just wouldn't get away with it.
exactly.
That's happening now.
And we have to stress, don't we, that both of us have had that experience these days with groups of Italian teachers that amazing things have happened in the last decade and a half in Italy. It's just, I think in Spain as well. The competence of teachers at very young levels is much better these days, and I think that's to do with the world we live in. Also, Erasmus opportunities. Teachers take these opportunities, and they have to function through English when they're out in these contexts. So we have to say thank you to Erasmus.
Yes.
That's my alarm going off again.
Okay. We're on 30 minutes. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, it's not a bad place to stop.